that better? Yeah, it is. Good morning, everybody, with amplification. So, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about apologetics this morning. Pastor Tim said I have, I think, 35 minutes or so, 30 minutes. So, for the next hour and a half, I'm going to be going over, just kidding. Before I get into all of that, I'm going to take just a minute to talk about Gary, which, just full disclosure, I never met Gary. I've learned a bit about Gary from Pastor Tim and from some of my friends on Facebook, which is really interesting. So Pastor Tim shared with me an image that was in some ways kind of advertising this morning's message, and I shared it with some of my friends, and then I started getting these comments from people that were like, oh, I knew Gary, or I was impacted by Gary, or I learned a lot from Gary. And so I'm honored to be able to do this. It sounds like a really, really great guy, and it sounds to me like he valued apologetics and theology and doctrine, but was able to take these lofty concepts and kind of bring them down to the street level, right? And make it accessible to normal people like me, like most of you. So I want to honor Gary. I think that's awesome that he did what he did. I think it's awesome that you guys are doing this annually. But I also want to honor Pastor Tim. I don't know Pastor Tim that well. We met at a luncheon a few months back for pastors and ministry leaders, and we had a nice conversation there. But then he reached out to me via email just a month or so later and was talking about this service and an opportunity to speak. And so I said, well, let's chat in person so we can really figure out what folks need to hear or what the Lord's saying to us. And so we had a good meeting here, and I got to tell you that there's just something about adoption. And you guys know Pastor Tim much better than I do, but he's got a big family, right? And there's something about adoption, I think, that even more than apologetics and evangelism, which is super important, right? Apologetics and evangelism. There's something about adoption that just shows this embodied, living picture of the gospel. And so I want to say to you and to your wife, and I just met you. What's your first name again? I'm sorry. That's right. I just want to say that what you've done and what you are doing is such a picture of God's grace towards all of us orphans, right? And God doesn't have any grandkids, so there's just something so beautiful about adoption. And that is a real witness to a world that is in desperate need of grace. So thank you for doing that. I want to just honor them too, along with you. In a world where words are cheap, actions and lifestyle choices are very valuable. And your actions speak loudly. I'm going to set my Bible up here, and I'll probably forget it. Help me with that, would you guys? All right, so anyway, Rethink 315. I don't want to talk too much about this, but it is a relatively new ministry. We focus on, and by the way, in terms of slides, is there someone that can help me to, do you have a clicker, or do I just cue you guys? Okay, great. If you don't mind, go to the next slide. We're a relatively new local ministry, but I've been serving in this capacity for over 10 years, working with teenagers and young people in the realm of apologetics, college prep. Our mission as a ministry is to increase the number of Christians clearly and confidently sharing their faith, and to decrease the number of professing Christians, particularly our young people, but not exclusively, but particularly our young people leaving the church due to unanswered questions. And I know that's a mission that is close to my heart, close to my family's heart, close to Daniel, our ops director. He's here visiting. Thanks for coming today, Daniel, and some friends too from our prayer meetings. But I know it's on your heart as well, Pastor Tim, and this church's. So I think we're in unity here with a mission like this, and we're aiming our efforts towards students between the ages of like 16 and 20, and our big focus is apologetics. And I've been doing this kind of thing full time since 2010, but I've been in volunteer youth ministry for, over 15 years now. I'm 43 too, just to give you some context. I got saved at 17, so young people are important to me. Anyway, all that to say, I get a lot of credit, for being like the face of the ministry. ministry, but it's a team effort. I'm just one of the leaders. If you want to learn more about the work that we're doing locally with churches and schools and the homeschool community, please come see me after the service. Okay, that's the end of the commercial. So here's something that I like to do when I talk about apologetics, following the lead of one of my mentors, a guy by the name of Mark Ryan. He's the director of the Francis Schaeffer Institute in town. Really great guy. He loves apologetics. He loves people. And he likes to ask, so what comes to mind when you think of this word apologetics? And if we had more time, I'd actually try to interact with you a bit more and hear your thoughts. But a lot of the answers that come back are answers like defending or debating or sometimes even arguing. Maybe topics like science or the Bible or history or philosophy. And these terms, they're in some ways, I think it's fair. Like a lot of these terms should be associated with apologetics to an extent. But some of these terms they're a bit loaded. I think, go to the next slide. I think sometimes, after that one, keep going. I think sometimes when we think about apologetics and apologists, especially if we watch a lot of TV or we spend a lot of time on YouTube or whatever, we might think that this is all about arguing and debating. You might get images of stuffy academics and intellectuals debating in a college campus. Are you with me? I know that you had a great example in a guy like Gary Varner here, but just generally speaking, like pop culture, apologetics, is it fair to say that sometimes this is what comes to your mind when you think about apologetics? Am I on the right track? Okay. And so while apologetics isn't less than debating, or sometimes even arguing with gentleness and respect, it's so much more than that. And so I think what happens is when we talk about apologetics, the tendency is for us to sort of define this term very narrowly. And my hope this morning, over the next few minutes, is to just maybe broaden our definitions a little bit. In the spirit of Gary Varner, we're going to do some street-level redefining of apologetics. And a lot of this won't be new to you because it sounds like Gary was already on this path. But there's a lot of technical terms, a lot of topics that are associated with apologetics, this posture of arguing and debating. This is, in some ways, a stumbling block to the rest of us, maybe, that aren't inclined towards arguing or debating. And unless you're disciplined or motivated enough to study and master a list of very technical topics, you might feel like apologetics is just not for you. It's not for your church or your ministry or for your dining room conversations with friends, family, kids, etc. So we're going to take a look at this word, apologetics, and I'm hoping that together we can just maybe rethink what this term means. And then, of course, we'll talk a bit about evangelism. But next slide, please. So this word, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a language expert, I'm not trying to get fancy by putting this up there. Tim probably knows how to pronounce this correctly in the Greek, but this word apologia, it comes from 1 Peter 3:15, and if you guys have your Bibles handy, go ahead and turn there. 1 Peter 3:15. This Greek word apologia is found in this verse, and it's found in a lot of other verses in the New Testament, but this is sort of like the apologetics proof text. Like if you're at an apologetics conference, this will be on the bumper sticker of just about every car in the parking lot, okay? 1 Peter 3:15 says this, "In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense or to give an answer, that is an apologia, to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." So that's what 1 Peter 3:15 says, and this word apologia is usually translated to mean verbal defense. And that's a correct translation. That's a fair translation. And again, I'm not a language expert, but the word itself is actually it's broader than that. It's richer than that. There's more meaning than just defense. And I'll get to that in a moment. But if you think about it in terms of only defending, then sometimes it has this almost like legal or sort of courtroom vibe to it, right? And unless you're a big fan of cross-examining your friends or cross-examining non-Christians or arguing and debating as if you're in a courtroom setting, again, that way of thinking about it can be a little bit of a turnoff. A little bit of a turnoff. And so, and by the way, I get it, and I mostly agree too that that's a correct definition. But this word apologia, expanded, you can actually pull a lot more meaning out of it. It's almost like the word love, right? There's a lot of different meaning baked into this word. This could be understood to mean a reasonable reply. Apologia, a reasonable reply. A thoughtful response. A word back. Or more simply, an explanation or an answer to a question. So, offering a word back or an answer or an apologia to people that ask us questions. I mean, this overlaps with just about everything, right? Evangelism, discipleship, spiritual formation, outreach, Grandma Edna's knitting club. Like, it's applicable, right? In all of these, that was a joke. It's okay to laugh right here, Tim, is that all right? I know it wasn't a good joke, but just humor me, right? I'm just getting warmed up, it's early. No, but really, like, all the things that we do as churches and in our ministries and in our homes, like, you're always answering questions. I mean, how many of you just within the last week or month or year have answered a question about church or the Bible or Jesus or Christianity? If you've been asked a question and you offer a word back, you're doing apologetics. So I want to, just kind of demystify this term a little bit, if I can. So what's interesting, though, is the author of 1 Peter probably wasn't thinking specifically about lawyers and debaters and academics when he wrote this epistle. As a matter of fact, this epistle, it was written primarily to just normal, everyday, average Christians like us, dispersed throughout these Roman provinces in Asia Minor. And while, more technical stuff under the umbrella of apologetics, like the cosmological argument or teleological argument, those things are associated with apologetics currently, the people hearing this letter, they weren't thinking along those lines. As a matter of fact, when they were told to give an answer or to give a word back, the questions that they were being asked would seem really unusual to us. Questions like, and by the way, again, first century, okay, this is in a context. This book was written in a context. So the folks listening to this, they were being asked questions by non-Christians, Romans, Jews, etc., people in their communities, people in their spaces, and the questions would sound like, are y'all atheists? Isn't that a weird question? It doesn't make sense to us. But because the Romans worshipped so many different gods, these first century Christians saying, no, we worship one triune God, right? We worship one God. Well, the Romans are like, well, you must be atheists because you don't believe in all the gods, right? Isn't that strange to think? How many of you lately have been accused of atheism? Just raise your hand. Anybody? Right, because it's a different cultural moment, a different context, different questions. Another question that these folks were being asked was, are y'all cannibals? Does anybody know why? Just shout it out if you know. Yes, sir. Communion, that's right. Jesus said, this is my body, this is my blood, like eat and drink. And so, and while that teaching was hard for even some Christian, or at least some people close to Jesus, the non-Christian world was thinking about this in terms of like, what, you're literally eating people? Like, this is weird. Are you cannibals? And so offering a word back or an apologia to that question, that sounds a little different than contemporary apologetics, doesn't it? And there's a few other questions too that they were being asked, and none of them are answered in Lee Strobel's latest book. Or Josh McDowell's, or Francis Schaeffer's, or Nancy Pearcey's, or pick your apologist, right? And so, in that context, these first century Christians would be responding to first century questions asked in a first century context. Next slide. So a big point that I really want y'all to take home with you is that different people ask different questions at different times in different contexts. So while defending against charges of cannibalism is not commonly associated with modern day evangelism and apologetics, and because these questions aren't common in our cultural context, the question is, well, what are some of the common questions? And Gary actually would probably have a lot to say about this. But some of the common questions that we're hearing these days are more closely associated with answers to the new atheist movement than the common, everyday, average questions that we may be getting. Let me unpack this a little bit. So in the early 2000s, late 90s, you can go to the next slide. There was a group of guys and some gals, they were called the New Atheists. It was this kind of ragtag bunch of guys touring college campuses, doing debates, doing lectures. And again, late 90s, early 2000s, folks like Richard Dawkins, Chris Hitchens, Sam Harris, you've heard a lot of these names, I'm sure. They were gaining popularity, in part because they were like rock stars, traveling these college campuses. I mean, literally, students were like getting autographs, right? Because these are published authors, they're making a wave in the culture and the community. But another thing too that not a lot of people know is a lot of these new atheists were pioneering online content on this little platform, tiny, teeny little platform called YouTube. You ever heard of it? Well, in the late 90s, early 2000s, like it wasn't exactly what it was. And I'm not sure when the genesis of YouTube, like when it actually blew up, but in social media circles and with online content being so new, like a lot of these guys were just, man, they were blazing new trails. They were innovative, let's say. They were very innovative. And so a lot of college students, again, late 90s, early 2000s, they're hearing these guys, they're being exposed to this information, and suddenly questions around the dinner table are sounding a little different. Little Susie, little Johnny are coming home from college during Thanksgiving break, and their questions or their objections or even their posture towards church and Christianity is a little different. Is this ringing bells for any of you? So these authors and speakers, they popularized really a lot of old ideas. They call it the New Atheist movement, but the ideas weren't that new. But they sort of breathed new life into a lot of these questions and objections. And again, suddenly questions around the dinner table were just sounding different. And pastors and youth pastors and parents and grandparents are like, wait, that's a new question, or man, I haven't really been trained to answer that, or that's not something that I'm familiar with. I'm not so sure. And this created a lot of reactionary programs and apologetics models. And anyway, I'm getting into the weeds here, but my point is that a lot of folks weren't sure how to deal with these new questions. And so they were kind of answering new questions with like an old playbook, let's say, right? And let's camp out here just a minute, actually. Let me expand on this. How many people here agree with me when I say that the questions, doubts, and cultural issues that today's young people are trying to sort out are a little different than the issues that boomers were sorting out? Do you agree with me? Like, a little different, right? A little bit, tiny bit, maybe a lot. What about the questions that even Gen Xers or even millennials were trying to sort out? In today's cultural moment, the difference between those issues is it's a giant chasm. Even in the last 7 or 8 years, the questions have changed dramatically. When I became a Christian in 1996, most of the questions that I heard, and even the questions that I asked, they sounded like these. Where would I go if I died tonight? Which Bible translation is the best? How do I find a good spouse? How do I pick a good church? How do I identify and refute heresy? If you're a Southern Baptist, how do I convince my Reformed friends that Jesus only ever drank grape juice? That's a scary joke, because I'm not even sure how you guys feel about that. Let me move on. Christian liberty, don't sever your conscience, okay? Anyway, should have checked that one first, Pastor Tim. Anyway, So all right, good. Let me fast forward just a bit into my early days as a volunteer with youth, and later into full-time ministry. The questions that I was hearing, they weren't really those questions. These questions that I was hearing were more informed by the impact the new atheist movement was having on young people and college campuses, and then that trickle effect into churches and into discipleship models and apologetics and evangelistic models, okay? And these are some of those questions, these are some of the questions I was hearing, influenced by the new atheist movement. Are we sure the universe was really created? I mean, come on, like science and stuff. Are we sure the Bible is accurate and reliable? I mean, come on, Art Urban, everyone. Are we sure Christian sexual ethics aren't outdated and bigoted? Are we sure the reality of evil and suffering doesn't disprove the God of Christianity? Like, these kinds of questions were informed by the new atheist movement. And we were all playing catch up, right? We're in youth ministry, oh my gosh, like, these are different than the playbook I have from my boomer mentor. And no offense to boomers at all, it's just that things change, right? The playbook I have doesn't address enough of this, so we need to rewrite our playbooks, we need to add this. And then the questions started changing again, and again, and again, and again. But apologetics had this moment of resurgence, let's say. And this is, again, late 90s, early 2000s. I'm not a historian, you can fact check it if you want, but it seemed to me that there was this resurgence and an interest in classical evidential apologetics, the stuff that Gary loved, the stuff that Tim loves. And then the questions started changing again. So around 2014, 2015, almost overnight, I saw how young people's questions and objections were being informed by ideas and cultural factors that are more novel, more complicated, and I would say more complex than anything you're going to find in a Richard Dawkins book. But most of our apologetics endeavors, our evangelistic strategies, we're still offering answers to the public enemy number one, right? The new atheists. And so, if you look, and by the way, just a side note, if you look at the national stats, the number of folks that are like legitimate card-carrying atheists is actually kind of slim. Talk to most people on the street level, you'll find that a lot of folks in our culture, like they're not atheists. They're actually pretty spiritual in some significant ways. They believe in things besides the natural, like strict secular humanism or naturalism. That's not as common as we were led to believe, in my opinion, and based on some of the stuff that I've experienced and read. But anyway, all that to say, the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? And the new atheists were sort of like the vocal minority. They're very loud. But different people ask different questions at different times. And you've heard the same, right? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So maybe the questions are changing a bit, but we're still offering these answers that are as helpful or as relevant. Anyway, moving on. By the way, how am I doing on time? You're good. Am I good? Okay, all right. I know that guy back there sleeping, so I just wanted to be careful. I'm kidding, nobody's sleeping as far as I can tell. So when the questions change, our tendency, I think sometimes, is to resist that change, right? We want the tried and tested. We want the four spiritual laws. We want Romans Road. We want, whatever worked for us in our moment, in our context. I know in Gary's context, being a crew guy, things like evangelism, explosion, four spiritual laws, that was really good stuff for that moment. And it's still good for some people, but a lot of these questions are changing, morphing, evolving. And so, and by the way, let me be clear here. When I say things like relevant, I say we need to stay relevant or we need to stay current. I don't want you to hear something that I'm not saying, okay? Yes, relevance is important, staying current is important, speaking the language of the people that are in front of you is important, but to be clear, the biblical narrative, creation, fall, the law, the prophets, redemption in Christ, restoration in Christ, that will always be relevant. Okay? I'm not saying that we somehow change the truth to fit the times. It's not what I'm saying. As a A pastor used to say in Seattle, used to say, we hold the truth in a tight fist, but we hold our methods in an open hand. I think that's a really good policy. It's a really good way to think about evangelism and apologetics and answering questions. So again, Jesus, the hero of the biblical narrative, is always the answer to every question. That never changes. The gospel is the answer. But but just like you see in the New Testament, the epistles, right, and the book of Acts, depending on the crowd, the way you talk about the gospel, you can flex and pull and push with that a bit, right? There's some room there for creativity. So what I'm asking you guys to rethink is not the timeless truths of Christianity. I'm just saying we need to maybe rethink the way we package this. The same way we've been rethinking the way we package it from generation to generation to generation. As the culture changes, people change, things change. What I'm talking about here is the difference between Peter's readers being asked about cannibalism versus college kids in the 90s and early 2000s being asked questions informed by Dawkins and the New Atheist movement versus high school and college kids today. As one apologist puts it, the gospel is never heard in isolation. It is always heard against the background of the culture in which one lives. Next slide, please. I'm going to repeat this quote. The gospel is never heard in isolation. It is always heard against the background of the culture in which one lives. Friends, this is the background noise buzzing in the ears. Not just the young people that we care about and are concerned about, but yours too. Mine too. So as I wrap up here, as a disclaimer, again, don't misunderstand me. We're not talking about changing the timeless truths of Christianity. And I'm also not saying that answering questions raised by the new atheists is something that we should just disregard or forget about. Those questions are still important, extremely important. As a matter of fact, I'm starting to think, and I didn't really flesh this out, but I'm starting to think that classical evidential apologetics should probably be incorporated into our spiritual formation, into our catechisms, into our discipleship models. I think this is just as important as working out your doctrine and theology. They say that theology or your doctrine is what you believe, and apologetics is why you believe it, or why it's believable. So it's the plausibility structure that holds up your beliefs. Holds up your beliefs. Very important. Those questions raised by the new atheists, I'm not saying forget about those, because they will come up from time to time, but not everybody you meet on the street is a scientist, or a philosophy major at a major university, right? Or a historian, or as a disciple of Mark Ehrman, or just pick your popular sort of anti-Christian scholar. Not everybody you meet really cares about your views on evolution, for example, or my views, first three chapters. Again, we can't just push every evangelistic and apologetics conversation into these categories that we're comfortable talking about. We need to listen to the people in front of us and answer the questions that they're actually asking. And then speaking of questions, as I get close to wrapping up here, in light of what I just said, I think the questions that we should be asking ourselves are just as important, if not more important. This is really convicting for me. Maybe some of us, including me, need to stop asking, how do we get our leaders and young people ready for debates with atheists? And we need to start asking, in light of 1 Peter 3:15. By the way, that's the Rethink 3:15 bit. We're rethinking 1 Peter 3:15. But maybe we need to start asking ourselves, am I honoring Christ the Lord as holy? Am I living a life worthy of questions? What might it look like to offer answers, an apologia, a word back for the hope that I have? To answer these questions in a way that's both pleasing to the Holy Spirit, but also biblically faithful. And then finally, what does it look like to do this all with gentleness and respect? Oh, that's the hard part, right? I'm a recovering jerk. Nice to meet you if any of you are also on the same path that I'm on. I've been recovering for many, many years now, ever since Jesus got a hold of me. And you know, a lot of us, if you're interested in apologetics and theology and church history, and you just love these kinds of topics, I mean, it does. I don't know if it creates or just attracts, but you like being right. Sometimes I am more concerned with being right than I am with loving the person in front of me. And I've heard someone say it this way, that if you're debating and arguing and you're making people feel small, you're making people feel dumb, you're basically kicking legs out from under the stool they're sitting on, or you're pushing them into a corner with your leading questions, you treat them like you're cross-examining, like all these things. If that's what you're doing, you may be doing apologetics, he said, but don't call it Christian. That hurts, doesn't it? So anyway, so this isn't a talk to put more burdens on your shoulders, or to tell you that you all need to go out there and be Gary, or to be Josh McDowell, or Lee Strobel, or whoever you enjoy listening to. This is just a talk to say that people are asking you questions, and you're opening your mouths to respond. You are an apologist. You're doing apologetics. The question is, are we doing this with gentleness and respect? Are we really listening to the questions that are being asked? Are we doing our best to address those questions? Not just the questions that we hope people will ask, because we got lots of books and resources, but the questions that are actually being asked. So all that to say, actually that was it. That's all I had to say. All right. How am I doing on time? Is that 40 minutes or 35? Okay. All right. So, do I have time for a quick story? Okay. All right. Thank you. So my friend Derek, he's a praying man. He's a little more, let's say, charismatic than I am. Although I love miracles, healings, all that stuff. But anyway, he's in a tradition that's a little bit different than what I'm used to. And this guy prays all the time, man. And he is just, oh my gosh, he's an intercessor. He's asking me, can I get into apologetics, Jeremy? What are some books you might recommend? And I recommended a book, and it was a bad choice. It was this big, and it was topical, right? So hey, pick your chapter, buddy. And my friend Derek, we had lunch again, and he says, I don't know, Jeremy, I don't know if this is for me. I'm like, well, why not? He says, well, I get a couple chapters in, it's just so technical, it's so hard to understand. He's like, and these conversations don't sound like the kind of conversations that I'm having in my home with my kids, or with people that I know that are not Christians at work. And I said, well, hold on, okay, I get that. Maybe I should have given you a different book, but don't say apologetics isn't for you. Don't say apologetics isn't for you. And he says, why? I said, well, let me take a different track. Derek, why do you pray? Why is it so important to pray? And then Derek just lit up, right? It's like he got passionate. This is his area of expertise. He loves this. He says, I pray because, and then boom, boom, boom. Theologically accurate answers. Practical, pragmatic answers. I mean, this guy just had all these good reasons for the hope that he has in a God that answers prayer. And he went on and on and on. I said, stop. I said, Derek. I said, Derek. I said, listen. You are an apologist. If you weren't before, you are now. He said, what are you talking about? I said, I asked you a question. You gave me a word back, a response, an apologia. It was very good. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be a philosopher. Just be you and listen to the person in front of you. Give the answer that makes the most sense. And if you need some help, come talk to me after the service. Thank you guys for having me.